He thought he had killed the man-eating snake and saved the village. But what he found in its stomach revealed a terrible secret. Bandits had been feeding the snakes the bodies of their victims, and the authorities had kept quiet about it. He turned to the internet, and everything changed. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are from. The morning mist clung low to the ground, turning the forest into a place of whispers and silhouettes. Each step sank slightly into the damp soil, releasing the rich smell of decaying leaves and rain-soaked bark. Samuel Vargas had walked these trails 1,000 times before, but today there was an edge to the silence that made him slow his pace and listen more carefully. The usual calls of howler monkeys were absent, the flocks of parrots had gone quiet, and somewhere nearby, a lone cicada buzzed and fell silent as if sensing his approach. He carried his machete loosely in one hand, a rifle slung across his back, as was his habit during his morning inspection of the reserve that bordered his village. The forest was his world, both his livelihood and his refuge. He knew its language, the direction of bent grasses that revealed the path of tapirs, the faint claw marks where a jaguar had sharpened its nails, the soft earth pressed by the hooves of deer. But this morning he noticed something that did not belong. A line of broken saplings crossed the trail ahead of him, as though something massive had forced its way through. The ground was torn, the marks deep, and smeared across the leaves was blood still dark and wet, not yet claimed by insects. He crouched, touching the soil with the tips of his fingers, and felt the moisture that told him whatever had happened here had happened only hours ago. A heaviness settled in his chest as he rose and followed the trail. The forest seemed to watch him now, its stillness oppressive. He could hear his own breathing, the faint creak of his boots, the occasional distant cry of a bird taking flight. The broken branches led him deeper until he came upon a small clearing he had never noticed before. Its ground churned as if by some great struggle. And there, half hidden among the roots of a ceiba tree, lay the creature. It was enormous, longer than the height of 3 men laid end to end, its dark green scales dull with dust and streaked with fresh blood. The great body twitched faintly, a slow ripple that moved down its length, and Samuel realized the snake was still alive. Its eyes, once bright and unblinking, were now clouded with pain, and each labored breath pushed against the grotesque bulge of its midsection. The air smelled of copper and musk, heavy and metallic. For a long moment Samuel stood frozen, gripped by the primal fear that every man feels when standing near a predator large enough to kill him. Then, slowly, he stepped closer, his hand tightening on the handle of the machete. The stories came back to him, stories told around fires of men who had vanished while cutting wood, of children who never returned from the river. Everyone had blamed the snakes. He could almost hear the voices of grieving mothers and see the pale faces of fathers who had searched until nightfall. Anger began to mix with his fear. If this was the beast that had taken them, then here was justice lying at his feet, wounded and helpless. He felt the sweat trickle down his back despite the coolness of the morning. There was no one else here to do what needed to be done. Slowly, with a steadiness born of years in the wild, he raised the machete and struck at the serpent's head, again and again, until the massive body shuddered and fell still. The clearing seemed even quieter after it was over. Only his own heartbeat pounded in his ears. He stood over the carcass, chest heaving, the blade of his machete dripping with dark blood. For a moment he felt relief, a grim satisfaction that he had prevented more deaths, that the forest was a little safer. But his eyes kept going back to the swollen midsection of the snake. Whatever it had swallowed was still inside, and he could not shake the image of a human form trapped there. With a deep breath, he knelt and used the machete to cut into the belly of the snake. The stench hit him first, sharp and foul, and then came the contents, a tangled mass of half-digested flesh and bones. Shreds of clothing, a single boot still laced, a torn belt with a metal buckle, and clinging stubbornly to a wrist that was no longer whole, a watch with a cracked face still ticking faintly. Samuel recoiled, his stomach twisting. This had not been an animal's kill. The cuts on the snake's body, the fresh blood on the trail, they told a different story. Someone had hurt the snake before he found it, perhaps to force it to regurgitate what it had swallowed, or to punish it for what it had eaten. And whoever had been inside had not wandered into the forest by accident. He gathered the watch, the belt buckle, and the torn pieces of clothing, carefully placing them into the canvas bag he carried for collecting samples. His hands trembled as he worked, his mind trying to push away the thought that he might have just destroyed the only piece of evidence of a murder. When he was finished, he stood over the lifeless snake one last time. Its dull eyes seemed to accuse him, as though it had been nothing more than a pawn in something larger. The forest was silent again, but not with peace. It felt as though it was holding its breath. Samuel slung the bag over his shoulder and turned back toward the village. His steps slower now, each one weighted with the knowledge that he was carrying a secret that could not remain buried. By the time he reached the edge of the forest, the sun was higher in the sky, but the world felt darker. The children playing near the river fell silent as he passed, sensing the heaviness around him. He did not speak to anyone, only walked straight to his house and set the bag down on the wooden table. There, under the thin light coming through the window, he stared at the objects until evening fell, unable to shake the feeling that he had just stepped into a story that was far from over. Night came slowly over the village, but Samuel barely noticed the shift from gold to indigo outside his window. The bag lay on the table where he had left it, the broken watch face catching the last of the light and glinting faintly, as though reminding him it still kept time. He sat on the edge of the wooden bench, his elbows on his knees, staring at the floorboards, while the chorus of frogs began to rise from the marshes. The weight of what he had seen in the forest pressed down on him, and no matter how he tried to quiet his thoughts, the image of the swollen snake's belly and its grisly contents returned again and again. The clearing, the blood, the torn earth, all of it replayed behind his closed eyelids until sleep became impossible. When dawn finally broke, he rose with a hollow feeling in his chest and went outside to wash his face at the pump. The water was cold, sharp against his skin, and for a brief moment it cleared his mind. He could not simply leave this alone. A man had died, and the forest had been used as a grave. Whether the snake had been the killer or merely a tool, Samuel felt the dead man deserved more than silence. He began his search quietly, walking first to the home of a woodcutter who often worked near the northern trails. The man was sharpening his axe when Samuel arrived, and though he greeted him politely, there was something guarded in his eyes when Samuel asked if he had heard of anyone missing recently. The woodcutter hesitated, before shaking his head, saying only that the forest was dangerous, and people sometimes vanished when they went too far. Samuel thanked him, but felt the weight of unspoken words behind the man's silence. Throughout the day, he visited others. The woman who sold fruit at the market, the fisherman who mended his nets near the river, the old grandmother who never left her porch. Some shrugged, some crossed themselves, some warned him not to go poking into things that did not concern him. But a pattern began to emerge. Several people mentioned recent disappearances in hushed tones. Not only hunters, but also a young man from a neighboring village who had come to trade salt and never returned. They spoke of the forest as if it had grown hungrier in recent months. An old man sitting near the church told Samuel in a low voice that there were men working in the forest who did not belong to the village, men with guns and trucks who came at night. He said they dug in the earth for stones or metal, and anyone who saw too much did not come back. Samuel felt a chill at those words. It explained the gashes on the snake's body, the blood trail, the fear he had sensed in the woodcutter's eyes. The next day, Samuel returned to the clearing, this time more cautious. The carcass of the snake was still there, already crawling with insects and beginning to stink in the heat. He circled the site carefully, noting every sign. There were boot prints in the soft earth, more than one set, heavy and fresh. He found a shell casing half buried near a tree root. A fragment of blue cloth caught on a branch, and a line of blood drops leading away from the clearing toward a dry creek bed. He photographed everything with his phone, kneeling in the mud to get close shots. Then he followed the trail along the creek, moving slowly and keeping low when he heard the distant crack of branches. Through the trees, he glimpsed movement. 2 men in dark clothing carrying rifles, speaking in low voices as they checked the underbrush. Samuel's pulse quickened. He stayed hidden, barely breathing, until they moved on. When they were gone, he dared to approach the area they had been inspecting and found fresh tire tracks in the dirt and the faint smell of fuel. It became clear that these men were guarding something deeper in the forest, perhaps a mine, perhaps a camp. Whatever it was, they were willing to kill to protect it. Samuel felt his fear growing, but so did his resolve. He could not turn away now. When he returned to the village, he laid out everything on the table. The photos, the shell casing, the cloth, the watch, and studied them under the light of a single lamp. It all told a story, one that no one else seemed willing to tell. Someone had been murdered, his body fed to a snake to erase the evidence, and the killers were still out there. That night, as rain began to patter on the roof, Samuel thought of the family who must be wondering why their son or brother had not come home. He thought of the men with guns patrolling the forest, confident that no one would dare stand against them. And he thought of the authorities in town, who might not care at all. His decision came slowly but firmly. He would collect every piece of evidence he could find, speak to anyone who would talk, and then take it all to the police and the local government. If they refused to act, he would find another way to make them listen. Over the following days, he worked methodically. He mapped the trails where he had seen tracks, noted the times he heard engines at night, and spoke again to the villagers, this time with more insistence. Little by little, pieces of the puzzle emerged. A rumor about a truck that came every full moon. A whisper that the men were digging for rare minerals. A warning that they were not afraid to shoot intruders. Samuel's fear became a constant companion. He began checking the locks on his door twice each night, keeping the rifle within reach. Yet even as the fear gnawed at him, he felt a grim sense of duty growing stronger. He was no longer just a man who had stumbled upon a dead snake. He was a witness, perhaps the only one willing to speak, and that knowledge weighed on him like the jungle heat. One evening, as he stood on the porch watching the fireflies blink in the darkness, Samuel realized there was no going back. The forest that had always been his sanctuary now held secrets that demanded to be uncovered. Somewhere beyond the trees, men with guns were laughing around their fires, believing themselves untouchable. He turned back into the house, sat at the table, and began to write everything down. Every clue, every sighting, every word he had heard. When he was done, he placed the papers in a neat stack beside the bag of evidence. Tomorrow, he would take it to the authorities in town. He told himself that justice was possible, that someone would listen. As the night deepened and the rain turned into a steady downpour, Samuel lay awake, listening to the forest beyond the walls of his house. The sound was no longer soothing. It was a reminder that time was running out. that whatever was happening in those woods was still happening now, and that if he did nothing, more lives would be swallowed by the silence. The next morning, Samuel rose before the first light, his decision from the night before still burning in his mind. He packed the evidence carefully into a small canvas satchel, double-checking that the watch, the pieces of fabric, and the shell casing were wrapped so they would not be damaged. The papers he had written filled with his observations, and notes were stacked neatly on top. It felt strange to carry all of it, as if he were holding someone's last chance at justice in his hands. The air was heavy with the smell of wet earth as he set out toward town, his boots leaving prints in the damp road. The police station was a squat concrete building on the edge of the main square, its faded paint peeling in the heat. A few motorcycles were parked outside, and a young officer leaned against the doorway smoking a cigarette, barely glancing at Samuel as he walked in. Inside it smelled of dust, sweat, and old paper. The ceiling fan creaked as it turned slowly overhead. Samuel stood in front of the desk, where an officer with tired eyes looked up from his newspaper. He explained everything carefully, laying out the photographs one by one, describing the clearing, the snake, the body inside, the tracks, the armed men he had seen. He spoke for a long time, his voice steady, almost formal, as though careful words could force them to act. The officer listened with a flat expression and occasionally scribbled something into a logbook. When Samuel finished, there was a long pause. The man behind the desk looked at the photos, then pushed them back across the table as though they were nothing more than hunting trophies. He said that snakes in the area had killed before, that sometimes people wandered too far, and tragedy struck. Samuel insisted that the wounds on the snake were caused by a blade, that the shell casing meant someone had been there, that this was not an accident. But the officer only shrugged, saying the case would be filed, and that they had no manpower to go searching in the forest for trouble that might not even exist. Samuel felt a heat rising in his chest as he left the station. Outside, the sun was already beating down on the square, making the cobblestones glare. He walked across to the municipal offices, a whitewashed building with a flag hanging limply from a pole. Inside, the air was cooler, the floors polished. He asked to see a representative or someone responsible for public security. After a long wait, he was shown into an office where a man in a pressed shirt and gold watch sat behind a desk cluttered with papers. Samuel once again recounted everything, showing the same photographs and laying the watch and belt buckle on the table like offerings. The man nodded politely, listening without interrupting, but his eyes kept sliding toward the window, as though he were thinking of something else entirely. When Samuel finished, the official smiled thinly and told him that his complaint would be reviewed, that the appropriate authorities would be notified, and that there was no need for alarm. He suggested that Samuel leave the evidence with them so it could be processed. Something in the tone made Samuel's stomach twist. He suddenly imagined the photographs locked in a drawer, forgotten, and the case quietly dismissed. He gathered everything back into the bag and thanked the man, leaving the office with a heavy step. As he walked back through the streets, past the vendors and the children running with sticks, Samuel felt a terrible helplessness creeping over him. The world went on as though nothing had happened. No one seemed to care that a man had been murdered and his body fed to a snake. The image of the armed men in the forest returned to him, their rifles glinting in the sun, their laughter carrying through the trees. They were still out there, perhaps even watching the roads, knowing that no one would stop them. That night, Samuel sat in his kitchen with the lamp turned low, staring at the satchel. The rain had started again, pattering against the roof, and the sound was almost hypnotic. He thought of going to the regional authorities in the capital, but that would take days, and money he did not have. He thought of finding a journalist, but the nearest newspaper office was far, and who would believe a single man from a small village with nothing but photos of a dead snake? The fear of retaliation pressed close. If the men in the forest learned that he had spoken, they might come for him, or worse, for his neighbors. He stayed like that for hours, wrestling with the gnawing feeling that he had reached the end of what the system was willing to do. Around midnight, he stood and went to the window, looking out at the dark silhouette of the trees. The forest seemed to be waiting. Somewhere beyond that line of shadow, another crime might already be taking place. The thought made his hands clench into fists. When dawn came again, Samuel did not feel rested. He went through his chores in silence, barely noticing the greetings of those he passed. The decision he had been circling for days finally took shape. If no one would help him, he would have to find a way to help himself. He would make sure the truth was seen by people who could not ignore it, even if it meant drawing attention to himself. He began to prepare with quiet determination. Each evening he organized the photos, the notes, the evidence, laying them out in order and labeling them so that anyone could understand the story they told. He cleaned the watch, set it carefully beside the papers, and photographed it from every angle. He went back to the clearing one last time and filmed the scene, even though the carcass of the snake was nearly gone, the bones scattered by scavengers. The footage was grim, but clear. The work gave him a sense of purpose that steadied him. But when night came, fear crept back in. He imagined headlights approaching his house, the sound of boots on the porch, rough hands dragging him outside. More than once he reached for the rifle and sat waiting, listening to every noise in the night. Nothing came, and yet the threat felt as real as the damp air on his skin. By the end of the week, everything was ready. The evidence was no longer just a collection of objects. It was a story, complete and undeniable. Samuel looked at the neat stack of papers, the memory cards with photographs and video, and felt a grim satisfaction. Tomorrow, he would no longer depend on the disinterested faces behind desks. Tomorrow, he would speak directly to whoever was willing to listen. He stepped outside and sat on the steps of his porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. The cicadas screamed, the bats wheeled overhead, and the forest smelled of rain and leaves. He felt the weight of what he was about to do settle over him like a second skin. It was dangerous. It might change everything. But he could not turn back now. Samuel woke before sunrise, not from the sounds of roosters or dogs barking, but from the quiet resolve that had settled in him overnight. The fear was still there, but it no longer held him in place. He moved through the house deliberately, as though each step were part of a ritual. On the table, the papers and photographs waited in their neat order, the watch glinting faintly in the lamplight. He packed them carefully into the satchel again, then set up the small camera he had borrowed from a neighbor who filmed weddings. The camera was perched on an overturned crate, so it faced the table, and Samuel sat down in front of it, his face illuminated by the single lamp. For a long moment, he simply looked into the lens. The house was so quiet, he could hear the ticking of the watch, and his own breathing seemed loud. When he began to speak, his voice was low but steady. He told everything, from the moment he had set out for his routine inspection to the instant he had cut open the snake and seen what lay inside. He spoke of the trails of blood, the boot prints, the shell casing, the armed men guarding the forest, the villagers who whispered about disappearances. He held up each piece of evidence in turn, the belt buckle, the fragments of clothing, the watch, and explained where and how he had found them. Then he showed the photographs and the video footage from the clearing, the camera catching the grim reality of what was left of the snake and the churned earth around it. He did not raise his voice, but there was a controlled anger in his tone, the kind that could not be mistaken for anything but truth. When he finished, he sat in silence for a moment, then turned off the camera. He copied the video to his phone and uploaded it to every social media platform he could access, with the weak connection from the village. The files took a long time to send, the progress bar inching forward as the morning light grew brighter outside. By the time it was done, Samuel's shirt was damp with sweat, and he felt as though he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. At first there was nothing. The day stretched on, and he went about his chores with an almost dreamlike detachment, glancing at his phone every few minutes. By afternoon, there were the first few views, then a handful of comments from strangers asking if it was real. By evening, the number had grown into the thousands. Someone with a large following had shared it, then another, and soon the video began to spread far beyond the borders of the village. People wrote messages of outrage, of sympathy, of fear. Others asked for updates, for more evidence, for names. By nightfall, journalists were calling, their voices crackling over the poor connection, asking if they could come and interview him. Samuel agreed, though his hand shook as he put down the phone. He sat by the window in the dark and watched the glow of headlights on the distant road, wondering if they belonged to reporters or to the men from the forest. The next day, the square was alive with activity. Cars from the city arrived carrying journalists with cameras, microphones, and notepads. They asked Samuel to walk them to the clearing, to show them everything. He led them through the forest, pointing out the tracks, the creek bed, the spots where he had found the evidence. They filmed everything, speaking in urgent tones about corruption, illegal mining, and murder. Within a week, the story had reached national news outlets. The government could no longer ignore it. Investigators arrived with armed escorts, setting up a temporary camp on the edge of the forest. They questioned villagers, collected the evidence Samuel had gathered, and even used drones to search for the camps of the armed men. Several arrests were made when trucks full of stolen ore were intercepted on a back road. The village buzzed with talk. People who had been silent before now came forward, telling of brothers and husbands who had vanished, of trucks heard at night, of threats muttered by strangers with guns. It was as though Samuel's video had broken a spell, freeing everyone from the fear that had kept them quiet. Yet Samuel himself felt no triumph, only a tired kind of satisfaction. He knew that this was only the beginning. Justice was slow, and many of the men who had ordered the killings were still free. There would be trials, hearings, delays, and perhaps new threats. But at least the truth had been spoken, and it could not be buried again. One evening, weeks after the video had gone viral, Samuel sat on the porch of his house and watched the forest beyond the clearing. The air was heavy with the smell of wet soil after a short rain, and fireflies blinked lazily among the trees. The satchel no longer lay on his table. It had been handed over to the investigators. Yet he felt its weight still, as though the memory of it had become part of him. He thought of the man whose watch he had carried, a man he had never known, but whose death had changed everything. Somewhere, perhaps, that man's family had seen the video and understood at last what had happened. Samuel hoped so. As darkness deepened, the sounds of the night returned, the croak of frogs, the distant hoot of an owl. The forest seemed calmer now, no longer hostile, but still mysterious. Samuel sat with his rifle across his knees, not because he expected an attack, but because vigilance had become part of him. He felt the old fear still, but it was tempered now by a sense of pride. He had spoken when others had stayed silent. He had given voice to the dead and forced the living to take notice. When he finally rose and went inside, he paused at the door and looked back once more toward the trees. They stood tall and dark against the starlit sky, holding their secrets. But Samuel knew he had taken at least one of those secrets and brought it into the light. Whatever came next, he would not regret that choice. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. take a moment to watch our other videos. There are more powerful stories waiting for you right now. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.